Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks so much for coming out on a Sunday afternoon. This is really lovely. Before we begin, I'd like to just begin with our tribal land acknowledgement. So I'd like to take a moment to recognize the ancestral lands of the indigenous peoples on which the Portland Art Museum now stands. We are meeting on the lands of the Multnomah and Chinook people. We pay respect to their elders, past and present. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, settlement, and resilience that brings us together here today. And please join us in uncovering such truths at any and all public events. Thank you to our colleagues at the Native Arts and Culture Foundation, based in Vancouver, Washington, who kindly offered their help in writing of this land acknowledgement protocol. And we encourage you to learn more about their important work to create fellowships and funding for contemporary Native artists across the country. So thank you again. My name is Grace Cook Anderson, and I'm the Arlene and Harold Schnitzer Curator of Northwest Art. And I've been at the museum for about 2 years, and it's been so fun. And the Apex is really quite a special exhibition series for me. It allows me to really work with an artist and to be able to create these sort of solo exhibitions and to be a part of a lineage that's been around for about 10 years. So it's a really great celebration of thinking about contemporary Northwest art. And today I'm very pleased to introduce the artist Stephen Young Lee, whose exhibition just opened yesterday. Has anyone had a chance to see it already? Great, wonderful, fantastic, thank you. So for this event today, I'd like to thank the Asian Art Council for hosting this event. There is a reception to follow just afterwards in the Stevens Room if you just want to join us just next door. And also to our Learning and Community Partnerships Department for organizing this event. For those of you in the Asian Art Council and our Northwest Art Council who hosted the reception on Friday, it was such a wonderful opening. We got to see, We got to see alumni from Alfred University that are here in Oregon. People really come out for their ceramics family, so it was really wonderful. And I've always said that if I could be adopted by an artistic family, it would be ceramics family for sure, because they're just great folks. So I'll give you an introduction to Stephen. Stephen Young Lee has been the resident artist director of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts in Helena, Montana since 2006. In 2004 to 2005, he lectured and taught at numerous universities throughout China as part of the one-year cultural and educational exchange in, I'm going to butcher this, but in Shanghai and Beijing and what's this other city? Jingzhezhen. In 2005 to 2006, he was a visiting professor at Emily Carr Institute of Art and Design in Vancouver, BC. And Steve has lectured extensively in North America and Asia. In March 2013, he participated on a panel called Americans in the Porcelain City at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. In 2013, he was one of several international artists invited to participate in New Blue and White, which was an exhibition at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. That featured contemporary artists working in blue and white tradition of ceramic production. And in the fall of 2016, his work was featured as part of the Renwick Invitational at the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. So Lee is represented by Duane Reed Gallery, Fair and Contemporary Art, and the Archie Bray Foundation Gallery. And his work has been collected by the Smithsonian Museum, the Daum Museum of Contemporary Art, the Four Seasons Hotel in Seoul, Korea, as well as many private collections. Steve received his BFA and MFA in ceramics from Alfred University. And originally from Chicago, he lives in Helena with his wife Lisa and their son and daughter, Gavin and Florence, which hopefully you've had a chance to meet on Friday as well if you were here. So that's just his bio, but we're so glad to have Stephen here today and to tell us more about his work. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thanks so much for coming out today. We really appreciate seeing all of you, and for those that made it out on Friday. And thanks to the Portland Art Museum. This is really an honor to be able to have an exhibition here in the museum, particularly at the Apex Gallery, which showcases Northwest artists. It's really been a great experience, and I've just appreciated working with Grace, the curatorial staff, and the installers who were helping me out this week just did such a great job, and were really wonderful to work with and very thoughtful in the way they approached everything. So today I'll share a bit about my work, and there's kind of two components during my talk. The first part will be about just some of the journey in where I've come to today with the work, and then the second part will be about the Archie Bray Foundation, which is a place that's very near and dear to my heart, and has a lot of my energies, I suppose you could say. So I wanted to start by showing this image. This is a jar from the Joseon Dynasty, 18th century, and it's a jar with grapevine design on it. And the reason I like to start off with this is that this is one of the earliest pieces I remember being really just almost obsessed or very much enamored with an object. This was back in high school. I had taken ceramics as an elective, and one of the assignments was to reproduce a piece from history. So I found this image in a book about Korean art, and not really knowing much about the history or anything like that, I just kind of fell in love with the image of it. So I, with my very rudimentary pottery skills, started throwing these forms, and then I would try to mimic the grapevine design, and then I'd kind of get to the edge of the pot, and I didn't know what was happening, because that was the only photo I had. So it was like this moment where I had to take a bit of a leap or a risk in determining how I thought that design continued to the other side. And I continue, this pot still is very inspiring for me. I often reference it, and it's just such a beautiful object with the proportions and the volume. And I think this was, for me, a memory of like the earliest memory for me of just initiating that love for historical objects. So my practice currently involves the reproduction of historical elements in an effort to understand and reinterpret aesthetics and context in which they were made. This is a piece called Birds of North America from 2007. And I'm very interested in the exploration of identity and cultural influence through material and craft. My early career, so I actually went to college as a business major, having no real concept of what it meant to be an artist, and I found myself migrating toward the ceramics studio late at night. So after about a year, I switched my major to ceramics and had met more artists who were professional artists and teachers that helped kind of shape my understanding of like what it meant to pursue that full time. And I was very much drawn to making handmade functional objects. So I really focused quite a bit on making very utilitarian ware, functional pottery, which I have a deep respect for. I think making pots for kind of public use is quite an amazing practice. I mean, it's a very rigorous practice. It requires a lot of time and dedication. And I think for my work, I've focused a lot on like a simplicity and gracefulness of form. They weren't very ornate, but really trying to make sure the proportions and volumes were, just at the place that I wanted them to be. Very simple glazes, and but also kind of finding ways. These are soda-fired pots, porcelain pots that go into an atmospheric kiln, and then it kind of gets introduced with different vapors that will change the nature of the glaze. So one of the things that's interesting about pottery is that not only are you trying to achieve a perfection in the work, but you're trying to achieve something even a little beyond that. So like the surprises in the kilns or things that reveal themselves that you might not have anticipated. And I became really conscious of also just trying to escape flaws or failure. So, making this work for public use, even just the smallest crack or the smallest change or warping of something can completely erase the value of it. So it goes right to the shard pile. And that was something that I felt like I was always contending with as a maker. And it brought to me this question of like kind of studio pottery and its relationship to industrial production throughout history. So, they often kind of held on to the same values, even though they were very different practices. I was always, I would often do a lot of art fairs or sell work through galleries, and I would often be confronted with comments like, that the work looked very Asian, and I didn't quite know at the time, like really how to. I guess I was always trying to understand what that meant, and I think it did look very Asian. If I'm being honest with myself, and part of the reason why I think is because that Asian ceramics were a lot of what I was looking at, and I just, for whatever reason, was drawn to looking at vessels from the Sung Dynasty in China, celadons from the Koryo Dynasty in Korea, a variety of Japanese ceramics, and that's really what kind of built the aesthetic vocabulary in how I was looking at the work and looking at the forms and the surfaces. But it also, I think, it made me think a little bit about how much I was given permission to access my culture. So that was a constant question, because I grew up in outside Chicago. I was born in the United States. My parents had immigrated from Korea, and I always felt like I wasn't that Korean because I didn't speak Korean, and I was surrounded by a lot of other Korean people who could, and that's a very difficult thing, I think, to deal with. But now I live in Montana, and I'm like the Korean, so I'm like the person that people look to for, some sort of an insight. So just that shifting, I think, of my role has changed, and funny enough, through this like career in making things out of clay, it's really helped me understand a lot more about my culture and really sparked a lot more research. This is an image of a man named Bernard Leach, who is a very influential figure in the development of contemporary ceramics. Mostly in the latter half of the 1900s, he brought a lot of understanding and information about ceramics into the Western world. And for better or for worse, he had a profound impact on the way that we sort of understand ceramics. He very much had an interest in Eastern ceramics, so Japan, Korea, China to some degree. And if you go into any ceramic studio nowadays, you see a lot of work that was influenced by the kind of work he was highlighting. So high temperature, you see celadon glazes in a lot of studios, chinos, things of that nature. And it's interesting to sort of unpack that because, I think a little bit about my education in ceramics was very much along those lines, and I learned a lot of those techniques and a lot about those materials that were sort of handed down from his influence. And I had this moment when I was teaching at Emily Carr, which had a lot of students that came, like parents who were sending their kids overseas to get an education in Canada. So there were a lot of Japanese, a lot of Korean, a lot of Chinese students. And I was this like Korean American guy who learned ceramic processes from a guy that had sort of a British man from the West. And it was just this really weird distillation and kind of ironic thing that I was teaching them, like how to make pottery, and they had to come all the way over from Asia to learn that. So, I'm often like really fascinated with how those layers exist and like kind of the evolution of the information. And another, and I think too about my parents, like they immigrated and fought their way to come to the US and then, so that their son could learn Korean pottery techniques like in America. It's like really kind of interesting. And another thing, Leach had been quoted, he said that culturally Americans had many roots, but there was no taproot, and inferring, I think, a bit of a disadvantage. But I think the reality is the advantage is we have access to such a rich diversity and so many different threads of information that can come and be a part of a new, evolving culture. In 2002, I went to graduate school, and I kind of came to a point where what I was making in functional pottery, like I just started to run into certain barriers. And it's not to say anything against that practice, but it just, at least for myself, I wanted to explore some ideas that went beyond that format. And I started making kind of awkward work. But when I went to grad school, I really felt like I had this freedom to just explore some different ideas and not feel so tied into that identity of being a potter, which is a very scary thing. It's a very scary place to be because my whole life as an artist was sort of wrapped into that. I was very proud of being a potter and being able to make that kind of work, but I wanted to be able to have a break from it so that I can start to explore different things and take different risks. But I also didn't have the tools really to do that, so I just decided I'm just gonna make the most basic thing that I can, which is this kind of brick form. But I was using the same materials, so I was using the same porcelain that I used to make the pots, but I made this kind of thick sculpture. And it was very interesting how the material revealed itself. So porcelain doesn't like to be very thick, and it often cracks, and it'll warp, and it'll do all these things that before I was kind of like avoiding and fighting. But then in this format, it didn't necessarily have to be anything. It didn't have to be a functional piece. So like those perceived flaws were starting to reveal themselves because the material was just being itself. So, that was a really eye-opening point for me because once I was able to kind of let that go, then I was able to sort of push the material in a way and then just let it reveal its characteristics and qualities. And then I was also like decorating it. I was like decorating these objects because that's kind of what I felt comfortable with. And I started using this inlay technique and then focusing on pattern, which was a very sort of systemized way that I could start applying imagery to the surface of the work. And I became really focused on the quatrefoil for some reason. I just was very drawn to this motif where you have multiple interpretations of what it could be. And the quatrefoil, I think, depending on how you look at it, it could be seen as an abstraction of a clover, of a flower. But I loved how you could find that same motif across cultural, religious divides. So on the top left, it's included in an aspect of Gothic architecture. The top right, in a Zen monastery in Japan, and then in the bottom is a little accent there above a mosque in Morocco. And I became really drawn to this idea of like pattern being this way that almost like a language, like where things could kind of travel across cultural divides or geographic divides. I also became really fascinated with blue and white ceramics, which I had seen quite a bit growing up, and in my house or at the restaurants or different places like that, but I'd never really looked very closely at it. So I did quite a bit more research just trying to understand how like these objects held so much information and they were able to travel such great distances and carry that information with it. So quite a bit of what we learn about other cultures or throughout history have learned about other cultures, is thanks to these objects and the durability that they've had throughout time. I also was really fascinated with sort of an adaptation of that. So in China, you had sort of the discovery of porcelain, and those Ming Dynasty vases or whatever were being created, and but those materials weren't necessarily available in other parts of the world. So place on the top left are Dutch Delftware pieces, and the bottom right, Italian Derudaware. So they didn't have access to the porcelains, but they did have low-fire earthenware. So they would take those low-fire red clays, cover them in a white glaze, and then try to mimic the blue and white ceramics that they were seeing. But then in the meantime, they were actually evolving and creating new genres of work, and then embracing that and sort of like putting their own signature on it. So, that adaptation is like, just wonderful to see that, how new things can be born out of a desire. And then these examples of chinoiserie, which are these, kind of see them as like these windows into the exotic, where you might have painters or makers from a different part of the world imagining what it's like in China, which was not very easy to travel to. And they were kind of creating these like hybrids of, what you imagine life would be. So you have this very idyllic scene of like a Chinese, landscape with very Western-looking figures, and then on the right, like Salvador Dali Buddha, I don't know what you would call that, but these wonderful moments that sort of get born out of that desire to understand. So part of my graduate work was I was taking what I considered archetypes of form, and then I would throw them into these solid blocks of clay, and then sort of deconstruct these objects into fragments. And then I started to build those fragments as maquettes, or use those fragments as maquettes to build larger pieces out of porcelain. And then, just abstracting them, so in a way they're like referencing Whitsell, they might be referencing architecture, and I'd refine the surfaces. And then instead of thinking of them as having a final sort of outcome, I just kind of kept pushing them through the process, the ceramic process, until my exhibition, my thesis exhibition. So here's a piece you can see the clay's moving and cracking and warping, and then I'm filling it in with kiln mortar, sometimes flipping them over in the kiln and then refiring it. So they're getting fired multiple times and going through the rigors of the ceramic process over and over again. And then the exhibition came, so that's kind of the final point, so that whatever state they were in, that's kind of where they existed at that moment. So this is a piece called Here Nor There, which is a large porcelain fragment. And I like that the objects became this, like a representation of a compressed geology, like going through that process over and over again, you get to see the time, sort of compressed into the pieces. And then I would use overglazed decals or underglazed decoration to kind of layer time and process in the work. This is a piece called Flight, where it has a little figure sort of running along the rocky edge. And then this piece is called Circum. And then this is the piece called Elegy. So this was the last piece I made when I finished school, and one where I started to use imagery that was maybe more specific. So this is a kind of a Chinese pine tree growing out of the side of the rocks. And it was fitting because at that time I was awarded a fellowship to go to work and live in China in the town of Jingdezhen, which is where porcelain was discovered over 1,000 years ago. And this was like the view out my window, which seems almost like if you were to concoct an image of like the rural Chinese landscape, like this is what it would look like. And this was actually what it looked like. So it was pretty wonderful. And this town of Jingdezhen is, it's so defined by this one material, this porcelain material, where industry, all of the kind of economy of the city revolves around manufacture of porcelain. So the vases from the Ming Dynasty, from the Qing Dynasty, many of them were built or made in sites and factories around the town. And these are just images I took walking down the street. You'd also really get a sense of the history of it all, of the material and its impact in the country. So often at antique markets, they would be selling these shards from hundreds of years prior that would be dug out of mountainsides or roadsides as they were doing new construction. And then also taking 1,000 years worth of knowledge and applying it to this one material. They were doing things that, for me as a recent master's degree graduate, I thought were impossible. But you would look at, these are cylinders that would be put together to create these large pots. And if you look for scale in the bottom left corner, there's a motorcycle. So these vases are sometimes 10, 15, 20 feet tall. And they were able to build these, just beautiful objects based on that ingenuity and understanding of what they were dealing with. This is like maybe one of my favorite photos I've ever taken. And I was just walking down the street in Shanghai and came across this. And, you'd think it seems like something's wrong, but really nothing's wrong here. It's just kind of a normal thing. It's sort of the world we live in. But I felt it was a good representation of how I tend to look at certain situations and then evaluate and sort of assess that. What's natural, what fits and what doesn't, or where are those areas that you think something should relate and shouldn't, or vice versa. One of the things that I was confronted with when I lived in China for that year was a lot of people would always ask me, it was like, well, what sign are you? And instead of thinking about, are you an Aquarius or whatever, it's like they were asking my Chinese zodiac symbol. So, I grew up going to Chinese restaurants and looking on the placemats with my family, and we all kind of like figured out what we were. And I was a rabbit. Like that was my sort of understanding of who I was. So luckiest of all signs, you're talented and articulate, affectionate yet shy. You seek peace throughout your life. However, I found out that it was right around the time of the Lunar New Year, and my birthday is January 30th. And I've discovered that because the Lunar New Year changes every year based on the sort of cycles of the moon, for that particular year, I actually wasn't a rabbit, but I was a tiger, you know? So it's a very kind of simple thing, but it it completely it really upended me because for 30 some years I'd been thinking that I'm a rabbit and that's my identity and this is who I am, and then suddenly I'm a tiger, which is like, tiger people are aggressive, courageous, candid, and sensitive. Beware of the monkey. It's like, what is that? I wasn't even looking for the monkey. So, it seems like this kind of innocuous thing, but it made me think a lot more about just how there are certain systems that exist for us to get some sense of like the people around us in our community and who you're dealing with, and how you sort of define character, personality. Politics is often a place where that happens. Different, cultural sort of structures that exist. But, I thought a lot about that, how just a simple moment can really kind of change the dynamic for myself. And, I wanted to, continue to sort of understand that a little bit more and maybe unpack that a bit. So I started to make this work when I was living there, where I wanted to like model, like basically trying to just deal with this fact that like my identity as a rabbit was changing. So I started modeling these forms and figures, and trying to do it in a way that was much more academic, if you will, because growing up in a Western art system, like it was much more idea generation than it was about like learning the kind of academic modeling. Whereas in China it was kind of the opposite, where people would be very good at sculpting anatomy, and then trying to understand how to use that to generate ideas. Like it was almost like two ends of the spectrum. So I'd never modeled a bust before, so I decided I wanted to model these rabbit heads. And then I would work within the factory system that existed in Jingdezhen to execute those pieces. So suddenly I wasn't doing every piece of the process. I was having to like let go of it and let other people participate in that. So I love this photo of the rabbit head next to Buddha and Guanyin, and just kind of going through the system. And these were the pieces I made during my final months there. So 2 of them are in the exhibition upstairs, and I really love that I get to see that work out with where things are now. I guess it's 15 years later or so. And I had a chance to install this in a factory, an old abandoned factory, and then had an opening, if you will, to bring the craftspeople who'd worked on this project with me all to see the work, because they hadn't been able to see things fully. So they got to see like, what was this crazy guy doing, and see the work sort of in its final stages. So this piece is called Instinct and Consequence. And I was right out of grad school, so not everything seems like it was fully resolved, but it's just kind of the place where I was mentally. And I was thinking a lot about familiar forms, so I had a lot of pagoda imagery that I'd been seeing. I was thinking that this sort of looked like the idea of a Christmas tree, which seems specific to the U.S. or other countries, Western countries. And I worked with a porcelain table maker who made picnic tables, hand thrown, and then he built this structure for me. So it's fully made out of porcelain. And then had these rabbits pressed out after molds were made of them. This piece is called Fortune's Fortune, which is, I was thinking a little bit about numbers and superstitions and the significance of numbers. The number 4 is very bad luck in China, which I had not known before. And then each rabbit is holding a bouquet of 13 flowers with 1 black rose in the back. And then the last was this series I called the Identity series. So I tried to model my own head as closely as I could. And then I used that mold to sort of absorb different culture or different identities of things that I'd seen since I was living there. So one piece was called Me as Buddha, me as Leslie Chung from Farewell My Concubine, and this is me as a good soldier. So even though Jingdezhen had 1 million people, it was still considered fairly rural, and there was quite a bit of Cultural Revolution imagery everywhere. So that was something that I was often confronted with. And then this piece was called Year of the Rabbit, which was a large head, probably about 3 feet tall, and then carved with flowers and birds and butterflies on the surface. I had an opportunity also to spend about 2 months in Korea while I was abroad, and really just took that time not to make art, but to do a lot of research. So I tried to research quite a bit about language, the history of the country, the development of certain crafts throughout its history. And I love these blue and white jars because I'd been seeing a lot of the Chinese Ming Dynasty jars, which have a certain precision to it, but then the Korean blue and white jars had definitely more of a freedom, I think, to the way that the painting strokes were on the surface. And I think it says something about the time, and again, it's like the objects become a way that you sort of understand what was happening in the country at that moment. And while these pieces were made, there was a different sort of social structure that was happening. Also looked at quite a few of these Koryo Dynasty celadons and the inlay, which in Korean it's called sangam. So it's a very unique ceramic process that was introduced by Korean craftspeople, which is inlaying into the ceramics, into the surface, and then filling it with a different colored clay. So I started to apply some of this to kind of getting back to my roots as a vessel maker. And I wanted to create objects that communicated an idea or maybe a certain cultural dissonance, or how to create harmony through that dissonance. So this is a piece called Granary Jar from 2008, which has a series of enduring cereal mascots from when I was growing up. Some of them seem to, for whatever reason, endure longer than others. So Tony the Tiger, the Honeybee, Trix Rabbit. This is a piece called Prehistoric Jar. So I like that idea of like kind of a collision of of imagery that might not seem to really make sense together, but certainly plausible that dinosaurs are once traipsing through Chinese landscapes at some point in history. And then this piece called Jar with Clouds and Bald Eagles. One of the objects, this is a jar from the Liam Museum, so it's another, it's called Pekja, it's like a white jar from the Joseon Dynasty. But I always love these objects because they're storage vessels, and if you look at it, there's a very clear line where the way that these objects are made, it was probably thrown in two parts, so you had a sort of a cone, inverted cone on the bottom and a hemisphere on the top. But when the top was placed on the bottom, the weight started to buckle the side of the piece. And they let that happen, like they just let that go. Instead of trying to achieve this sort of perfection or symmetry, they allowed that to sort of pass, I guess, as part of their standards. And what I think is so interesting about it is that the identity of the object doesn't change. Like it's still a storage vessel, still probably has the same amount of volume to the other jars that were being made. But now each piece has this completely unique, sensibility to it. So each one is very different from the next. And I love that idea that, because of what was happening at the time, which was sort of a Neo-Confucianist point in the Korean culture, they were able to let that happen. So the craftspeople were enabling that. And I think that that's such a beautiful thing. And I'd like to quote this, a quote from Joseph Campbell from The Power of Myth, where he talks about perfection is inhuman. Human beings are not perfect, but what evokes our love is the imperfections in the human being. And he speaks about the perfect human or the perfect God as being kind of uninteresting, because it's boring, and what's more lovable is the things that sort of go wrong. You can be in awe of something, but it's not necessarily something you feel love for. So that's when I started to, in earnest, pursuing these deconstructed objects. And in a way, I was trying to strive for perfection with the making of the objects, but then letting them be defined by their imperfections. And I was trying to eliminate as much as possible any sort of expectation in the work. So whatever the image of what I thought the ideal would be, to not hold on so closely to that and allow the behavior of the materials and the conditions sort of dictate the final piece. So this is a piece called Landscape Jar. This is Vase with Landscape. And it really brought, for me, a lot of my experience as a potter, where I was always kind of fighting and challenging that effort to make things perfect. But I found that beauty can really be found in the unexpected, and being open to those possibilities was one of the real challenges. So expectation for me became replaced by improvisation and reaction. So every time I was opening the kiln, I wasn't exactly sure what I was gonna see. This piece is called Vase with Scroll Pattern. And sometimes I'm setting them up so that the imagery might interact, with these punctures in the work. So this piece has it's called Jar with Octopus, and it's borrowing a motif from a Minoan octopus pot from history, but on a Chosun form. And then this piece you could sort of see, you can't really see that great, but the birds are sort of flying out as if they're escaping the opening. And then I just wanted to talk a little bit about my process. So I visit a lot of museums, I read a lot of books, I'm looking for a lot of like visual information. So often I'm looking at things that maybe seem kind of innocuous, like a band of pattern on the rim of a vessel, or, and I collect a lot of that information regardless of what culture it originated from. And then, I still am very committed to making pottery, so I do make pottery as part of my practice, and then often use that as a way to like start kind of testing out the imagery. For the vessels, I often throw them in sections, so sometimes they're inverted and then attached together later, and typically work in series. So here's a series of 4 vases that I've been working on. And I try to be very, very particular about the form. So I don't want it to seem as if it's being sort of this haphazard process, but I really do commit myself to maintaining a certain integrity in form and proportion. Some of the vessels I think of more of an archetype, things that you may see across a variety of cultures, and others are maybe more specific. And these are actually the 2 halves of a moon jar that I have upstairs, in the red blood moon jar. And then this is the piece after it's constructed. And then I often get asked about when the moment of kind of opening happens. So it's very often like when the piece is still very wet, but then once it goes into the kiln is where most of the movement happens. So I think a lot about this is just like releasing tension in the form, because certain places you can really get it to move more, but there is always a bit of a question as to how the final piece will turn out. These are the 2 vases. There's another vase upstairs, so these are kind of in process. And then here are just images of the way the decoration works for me. So as I mentioned, I use an inlay technique. So I'm using a knife to draw all the imagery on the surface, and then that gets filled in with a clay afterwards. Other times I use a white slip, and then I carve that away so it reveals a darker ground from the back. These are 2 examples of that. And then here is how they get set up in the kiln. So I use like a silica sand on the surface so that if they do collapse, they'll release from the kiln shelf. And these are actually the 2 vases that are in the show upstairs that are owned by Arlene Schnitzer. So you can kind of see they're a little bit more upright. And then in the next photo is where that gravity is starting to affect the form. And here are the 2 vases photographed. So sometimes these have, it's almost impossible not to have some expectation of what you think something might look like. So sometimes, they're within that realm, but other times they're not. Like other times you open the kiln and like this piece had completely toppled over, and at first I thought was a complete disaster, and then after I had a chance to look at it, I actually found that it was much more dynamic, than what I'd set out to do. But really, it's just to be able to appreciate these folds and the way that material is starting to shift and move on itself. This is a piece called Moon Jars with Dragon, where you have this sort of mythical dragon flying in and out of the openings of the 2 pots. I also really like the idea of exploring glaze and the nature of glaze. So often we're trying to stop glaze from running. But if you were to just let glaze run, it's often very beautiful and just so much depth and kind of just wonder sort of in that surface. This red underglaze is also something you see historically. Copper is what's causing the red to happen in a reduction atmosphere. Very volatile, very unpredictable. So I really like that idea of, instead of trying to control that surface, like really exposing that and letting the red kind of take over. And then here are a couple of platters using kintsugi on the right, which is a gold repair technique to sort of add value to work that has flaws in it. And then often reorienting pieces in the kiln, to sort of play with that idea of like the way the glaze flows or the way that the objects will present themselves in the end. This was a large basin that I fired on its side, and it just kind of closed and became this really amazing form. This piece is called Moon Jar with Spaceships. And then most recently I did a couple pieces with some kaiju imagery, which is just thinking back to my youth. So things that I felt like a strong identity to as a young Asian American, because there really wasn't all that much, to feel pride in. But here's Jar with Godzilla and Mount Fuji. And then Vase with Mothra. And then most recently, I've been working on a series of vases that are trying to emulate maybe historical glazes that had significance. So here's a vase with yellow glaze, which has almost like an imperial yellow color to it, and then gold lustered butterflies on the inside. This is vase with dragon handles and red glaze. And this is called Meiping Vases with Yellow Glaze. I also wanted to just share another project, and this kind of leads into some of the work that's in the exhibition upstairs. So this is a piece I made called Red, Blue, and White, which was 3 panels of 100 cups, so a total of 300 cups that were hung on a series of shelves for an exhibition that was in New York City at the Greenwich House Pottery. And each of these cups has a variety of different patterns on the surface. So they're not all the same, but they kind of inform each other through the process of making it. And this was one of the first pieces that I made that really was using ceramic production as part of, as subject matter, I guess, for how these pieces were coming together. So it was going back a little bit to the way I was working in China, where I was incorporating more people into the studio, working with assistants, and then learning how to let go of certain parts of the process. So we probably made 400 cups to get 300 cups that would work. And it was just a full production. So I was hoping, they're just distilling down the pieces to a color so that they would appear more like a color field painting. But then as you get closer, you start to see the little nuances of the pattern and the decoration on the surface. So some of the patterns evolved from one another. So you see some similarities, and others were very different, but you start to see threads of consistency through them. And this is the blue panel, and then the white panel. So recently I've been thinking a lot about plates. Plates have, I think, traditionally been a very difficult form for the studio potter because they present a lot of issues. They want to crack, they want to warp, because there's so much shrinkage happening with the clays. So really the best way to make a plate is to use a more industrialized process. But not to say it's not possible, but it's a very inefficient thing to just make in a home studio. So I was thinking about this process called a jigger jolly process, where you use molds and then you use a machine to help kind of turn a profile of a plate. So this is the first step of that process, where I'm just cutting out a profile, just using pen and paper. And then that gets transferred onto a metal blade that then goes onto this arm that kind of pulls down over your pottery wheel. And this is a process that was introduced in the 18th century, but very much has kind of gone by the wayside for whatever reasons. But you could see here, there's a plaster mold, then you put the clay on top of, and then as it spins, it gets pushed through that blade so that it's upside down. So the foot is being sort of turned, and then you can see here, you can also produce quite a few of them at a time. And I had stopped making plates completely just because it was such a pain in the butt, but then this process actually made it a lot easier, because then I could start to bring people in who could help turn the plates, and then I go back and trim and essentially still create them as a handmade object. And this coincided with my visit here in June when I came to visit the collection. And I've always been really enamored with these tiger and magpie paintings. So this is it's a motif that is very present in the Joseon dynasty in Korea. It's called Minhwa folk paintings. So they have this tiger character, and you have the magpie that, often these were created during the time of the Lunar New Year, and they'd be posted in front of people's homes to bring good luck throughout the year. And I was making this work sort of around the time of the Lunar New Year, and I really love this idea of the tiger. So from what I've read, the tiger is often seen to represent kind of the aristocracy or the ruling class, which is why it's got this often very goofy kind of expression. And then you have the magpie, which seems more dignified, and that represents the common people. So the people that were painting these were these itinerant artists that were kind of going from town to town, and they were sort of making a commentary through the art about what was happening in society at the time. So I was thinking back to imagery that I had been familiar with, and different tigers. I was thinking about Hobbes from Calvin and Hobbes and Tigger, and the Esso tiger, put a tiger in your tank. But Tony the Tiger was the one I think that had maybe the most staying power in terms of my upbringing, because I used to eat Frosted Flakes every morning for breakfast. And I love how he's evolved quite a bit into this almost heroic figure, whereas the original was this one that had more of a football-shaped head. And then from the magpies, I remember watching these cartoons, the Mighty Mouse cartoons, and you have these sort of agitators that are going in and causing trouble, and and just the magpie as an image, if you think about different cultures, they can run the gamut from being seen as mythical, revered creatures all the way to being seen as bad luck, or omens for bad luck, or just this kind of annoyance. And I remember when I first moved to Montana, there was quite a few magpies there, and I just thought they were the most beautiful birds in the world. I mean, they're so striking, but people in Montana hate them because they're loud and they wake you up in the morning and all that. So I was really curious about how you can shift that perception. So I was thinking about how to basically edit, the original scroll and include these characters in there. And then that kind of coincided with this interest that I had in producing plates. So I really liked how the plates as a surface, it presents itself as almost like a pixelated image. So it sort of starts to break down the imagery that is on the surface. And then being able to translate that onto the work itself. So, I was using technology to try to figure out an easier way to kind of move forward with this. And then here is just part of some images from the process of transferring the imagery. And I've never made a piece that big. It's probably the largest piece I've ever made. So I was only able to work on it in sections, and then hope in the end that everything worked out. And then along the way, had to create solutions. I started having neck problems because I was looking down at these plates, so I built this little easel where I could sit up straight. And then you can start to see how this came out. Another part that in order to build value, I had to use, I don't know if this video is going to play. Oops. In order to build value, I had to stipple everything. So I included this video. I guess it's not working. Oh, yeah. And I just wanted you to know how many dots I had to put onto this plate piece. It's the thousands of them. It was it's the worst decision I made, but it made sense. It was the right decision, but it just took so long. So here you could see, the crow or the magpies are starting to build value in the surface, and then this is a shot of the pine tree. So I'm standing on top of a table, looking down at this piece, and then each of those plates had to be inlaid with a cobalt slip. So this is Jake, who's a friend of mine who was helping me with this whole project. And then here you can see the magpies. And if you look closely here, you'll see that there is some cracking on the plates. So the way I approach that is there were 96 plates on the wall upstairs, and I only made 96. I just wanted that to be this little kind of moment of understanding like how much can happen throughout the process of making that, and like how much failure there might be, how much waste there could be. And I didn't reproduce any of them. Like I wasn't trying to make it sort of a perfect unscathed version of it. And here's the tiger. And then in order to hang it, so each foot ring had to be measured to the exact same size, 190 millimeters in diameter. And then there's a little recess that's carved away where it gets hung onto a set of screws. So they're all kind of in the same exact spot when they go on the wall. And then that's the early test of it. So I didn't have a wall large enough to actually see the whole piece, so I ended up I could hang them in rows of 2, and so I was able to do that, but I never got to see the piece up until I came here for the installation. But I did put it in our kiln room and then took a picture of it from a 10-foot tall ladder. And then here, thanks to John, he put together this cool time lapse of us installing it in the gallery upstairs. And also special thanks to Evan, who was just great with this whole project, and he sunk all the screws and measured everything out, and just it went about this fast, is what I'm trying to say. It was so easy, no problem. So that's the final piece in the end. A couple other pieces that on that visit, I also became really excited about this jar that really appreciate that the museum allowed it to be displayed in the space, so it's upstairs in the gallery. And this is a porcelain jar from the 19th century, made in Korea. And I wanted to make a couple of pieces that kind of had maybe some conversation with this as an object. So this is the first one. This is called Porcelain Jar with Cloud and Dragon Design in inlaid cobalt blue. And thinking a little bit about the dragon as this sort of mythological figure, both historically and then how that translates into now, and thinking about using an image that maybe is a little bit less serious and looked more like Puff the Magic Dragon, which seemed appropriate. And then the other piece that's on the wall is one that was made earlier, but influenced from that kind of a jar from Korea. This is a piece called Jar with Dragon and Clouds, and this was probably the largest scale piece I'd made to date. So it was a large porcelain jar where I was like increasing the scale maybe by like 100%, and the materials revealed themselves very differently at that scale. So they reacted differently, they behaved differently, and I felt like I was going back to graduate school where I started learning again how to make these objects. So a lot of cracking happened, earlier than I expected. But once I figured out how to glaze it, I put it back in the kiln, and then this is what happened. So it essentially imploded on itself, which was, a little disheartening at first, but it also presented us a new set of opportunities to be able to reevaluate and kind of look at the format of things. And this is the piece in the end. I ended up refusing and refiring parts and then using epoxies to kind of put pieces together and then finding a way to hang it on a wall securely. But what I loved about it was that it revealed the interior and the exterior of the vessel much differently, a little bit less direct, but there's just more room to investigate where the decoration kind of goes and how it originated and where the interior of the vessel lies within this mass of material. And then there's a wonderful moon jar by an artist named Kim Yi-kyung that's in the Korean section downstairs, and there are, I just thought this was such a beautiful piece, and the way she really is paying homage to this form. So I made this jar that was kind of mimicking that, but it was around the time of the recent blood moon. I was thinking a little bit about just the significance of these moments in time and lunar cycles and all that. So I made this piece called Blood Moon Jar that was trying to pay homage to her work. So that's the kind of work about the show, and then I wanted to also talk a little bit about the Bray and have a compressed kind of talk about this. So the Archie Bray Foundation is a place that I've been working for the last 12 years, almost 13 years, and it's place is very near and dear to my heart. And it's, it's been in existence for over, I think, 67 years now, and it's a ceramic residency program for artists. So a lot of people have gone through and been a part of this place and have really been sort of supported by it as an organization, myself included. I was a resident there in the late 90s. And I'll just share a little bit about the history and then kind of our current activities there. But it's a story about how just a few individuals can really initiate lasting change within their community. So this is an image of Archie Bray, who is a brick maker, and ran one of the largest brick manufacturers in the Northwest in the first half of the 20th century. And this is an aerial view of what the site looked like at that time. So it was a full brick making operation. Archie was a tough businessman, but despite this kind of dusty workman-like appearance, he really harbored a deep love for the arts. He would bring actors and actresses, dancers out from New York City into Helena to try to influence the arts in his community. And along with three friends, Branson Stevenson, Peter Malloy, they had this idea to create an art center that would exist on the grounds of the Brickyard and bring artists in that would be able to have an opportunity to work there and take advantage of the space and the equipment. So 1951 is when they first built this building, which is called the Pottery, because at that time, pottery was really the prevalent form of ceramic art. So that was the initial studio that housed the gallery, the studios, the classroom, everything happened in this one space. And unknowingly, this studio would become the first artist in residence program dedicated to ceramic art in the country. And they started with a simple mission, so to make available for those who are seriously and sincerely interested in any branch of the ceramic arts a fine place to work, which I think is such a beautiful mission. And this has really been the mission from day one. And it's kind of a, if you build it, they will come, like a hopefulness to it. And it really ended up playing out that way. So what happened next and who came next became a really important part of the story. Two graduates from Montana State University down in Bozeman drove up to see Archie at the request of their teacher. And it turned out to be Peter Volkes on the left and then Rudy Audio on the right. And they would work in the Brickyard during the day, and then at night they would make their own work. So I think it was that freedom that was given to these young artists that really enabled them to explore new ideas and challenge themselves and traditions in ceramics. In 1952, there was a meeting of Bernard Leach, Shoji Hamada, and Suetsu Yanagi, who at that moment I think were the most influential ceramic artists, and they were meeting Volkes and Audio, who were kind of the new vanguard to come. And it's a very important meeting of like the current and the future people who are going to be part of this field. And I think that that's been consistent with the Brays, that you have all these people that are kind of coming through and influencing one another, and it continues to evolve over time. So even though pottery was the norm at that time in 1952, things were very much going to change. You have Audio, who ended up going to the University of Montana and teaching there for a few decades, and he became known as sort of the Matisse of ceramics, and he'd paint these beautiful images on vessels and using the vessel as a 3D canvas. And then Volkes, who went on to Berkeley, California, really began an artistic revolution and ushered in an era of abstract expressionism in clay and changing contemporary ceramics, I think, forever. So together, along with others, they would really help to cross this divide between traditional craft and art. So it's very important that the seeds of that were sown at the Archie Bray Foundation. And whether Archie sort of foresaw that was going to happen is probably unrealistic, but I think there is a lot more to come on the grounds of the foundation. So fast forward to today, this is what the pottery looks like now. The Brickyard has long since closed its doors and been out of business, but the foundation has basically taken over the site and has continued to grow over the last 60 some years. On the grounds, we have about 26 acres of land and many pieces that have been left by past resident artists. So I always say it's like one of the few places that you can go and not see a full spectrum of ceramic art history, but you see a section of it. So it's kind of like going to visit the ruins in Rome. You get to actually see a physical manifestation of like what's happened in history in ceramic art. This is a piece called Aruna by Robert Harrison, who's an artist that lives in Helena, Sanam Imami, and then Louis Katz built this piece called the Brickyard Kiln in 1988. Our current programs we have an exhibition and gallery program, so we have rotating exhibitions that continue this mission of a fine place to work, and it's mostly showcasing the work of current and past resident artists. We have seasonal galleries that are open to the public that feature work that are made on the grounds. We operate a clay business that provides support, materials, equipment to the residents there, as well as to schools and artists within the region. And then we manufacture our own about 15 to 20 clay bodies on site. We also have an education program where we teach community classes for people within Helena or the surrounding area, anywhere from 5 to 10 weeks. Young artist classes where we hopefully get people started early. And then intensive workshops throughout the summer. So these can be anywhere from 1 day to 2-week courses where we bring in artists from around the country or beyond, and they teach the classes for people who come into Helena for them. And then every year we have an annual benefit auction and Brickyard Bash, which a number of years ago there was a group from the Portland Art Museum that came out, and we had a fantastic time with them, and definitely encourage people to come for that weekend. This year it's July 27th of 2019. And part of that event is we have a live auction, and then a cup auction and silent auction, and then of course we always end it with a big party at the end. So this is the big Brickyard Bash component of it. And if you know Beth Lowe, who's a wonderful artist in Missoula, like she always plays the bass as part of the band. She's a multi-talented person. But at the core of the Beret's mission is the residency program. So here is the David and Ann Shaner studio complex, which houses all the activities for the resident artists. And guided by that original mission of a fine place to work, it's really expanded over the years. So since its inception, the residency program has grown from 2 artists to 10 that work year-round for a maximum of 2 years, and then 10 to 15 more that come for summer or shorter periods. The long-term residency has a fellowship, so there's no studio rent for the artists that come, and then we also give $5,000 fellowships to help support expenses while they're there. And then the materials, firings are subsidized to a degree. And then our applications for people who are interested in coming, there are March 1st, so people can apply and propose different projects that they want to do at the Beret. And then we have the summer residency program, which is in a different studio building. And I love that the new buildings are interspersed or integrated into the old spaces. So there's still this kind of homage to what's happened there in the past, which has become very much a very important part of the landscape there, but then using that as inspiration for what's being made today. So the main building is a 12,000 square foot building, which was designed with a lot of input from artists who've worked all around the world. So it's a very easy space to work in. Included is a resident meeting center and the shared kitchen where people can share meals and conversation with one another. We have a full glaze lab for testing or development of their own glazes. Electric kiln room and a gas kiln room that uses improved technological, like computerized kilns that are much more efficient, but then we also have a variety of manual all the way up to computerized kilns. And then the other thing about the Beret that's always been very unique is that we have a lot of space. So we have quite a bit of room to experiment with new processes, including different atmospheric kilns, wood kilns, soda kilns, salt kilns. We actually just built 2 new ones this past year. And I like to think that the artists that come to the Beret are the future change makers of the field, because they are able to take advantage of the facilities and really start to push directions in their work. For example, once we received these large sculpture kilns, like people were immediately starting to push the scale in what they were doing and what they thought was possible. And many of these artists go on to become future educators, throughout the country, so they kind of carry that experience with them. So since 1951, there have been over 700 resident artists at the Bray. They've come from 46 of the 50 states and over 20 countries around the world. We get about 200 applications per year, so it's around an 8 to 10% acceptance rate, but it changes every year. So it's not like if you don't get one in one year, you couldn't another year. It's very circumstantial. And this need has grown. Like the applications are growing every year because new generations of artists, I believe, are benefiting from those early breakthroughs by artists like Volkas and Audio, and they're kind of seeking to push boundaries of their own. So of the 700 residents, this is kind of interesting, there are about 60 that have settled into the state of Montana, so it's become a way to grow the community within our state. And about half of them live in Helena, which has been a really great thing for us. Additionally, around the time of our annual auction, this event called the Montana Clay Tour started, so there are local studios that invite artists from around the state to show for that weekend, where you can have an opportunity to look at and purchase pots or sculptural work. And then the last thing I want to share is that we've been in the midst of some transition on our campus, where a few years back we've been designing and kind of re-establishing the use of the buildings from the days that it was a brickyard to now what's fully an artist studio and residency program. So the first piece of that was this new education center, which would help us to improve the quality of our educational offerings and then also expand the size. So this was about a $4 million building, and it would allow for a lot more flexibility, so large classroom spaces, or that you could segment, or one large space that you can use for bigger classes. So this is the building under construction a year and a half ago, and then this is it after we've moved in. So we're about a year into this building, and it's really been a pretty fantastic space for us to have more of an outreach capability with ceramics, and giving us a lot more flexibility to operate different classes and program offerings. And it includes a research library. And I saw the Portland library upstairs, which is a pretty phenomenal resource, it seems like. And I know it's by appointment only, so, but if, we're hoping someday we might be able to grow our library to a point where we can make it further available to the public. And then the other last component of this is that we renovated the original pottery building to our administrative center. So that's where all of our offices are and where we run all the programs. And this is our first staff meeting. Last thing I'll show is just these are images of the current long-term residents that we have at the Bray. So this is an artist named Christina Urives, who's from California, and her work deals a lot with her Mexican-American heritage and memories of her youth. Yoonji Kwak is originally from Seoul, South Korea, and has her MFA from RIT in Rochester. Very poetic forms. Richard James has his MFA from University of Kansas, and he does a lot of mixed media work, working with fabrics and textiles and ceramics and integrating them together. Kyle Johns is originally from Chicago. He and I actually went to the same high school, but many years apart. And he does these pretty amazing slip cast forms using a modular slip casting system, where the molds are almost as beautiful as the objects themselves, and referencing a lot of kind of architectural elements in his vessels. Eva Milovanovic is originally from Belgrade, Serbia. Went to the Rhode Island School of Design and makes these really wonderful, almost like folk art, these sculptures and installations. Jessica Brandel has her MFA from Ohio State. Had been a summer resident and then came back as a long-term resident. She's currently in her first year. Her work deals a lot with imagery and nostalgia from her upbringing in the Midwest. Kelly Stevenson grew up in Livingston, Montana, and has her MFA from Georgia State University, but came back as a resident and deals a lot with like figure and anatomy and narrative in her work. Kelsey Duncan from Idaho Falls has his master's from Ohio University and makes these really wonderful figurative pieces that deal with his kind of past in Idaho, rural Idaho. Ben Carter was a summer resident as well, has an MFA from University of Florida, and makes these really beautiful functional pieces out of earthenware. Ben's also, who's known for, he has a podcast called Tales of a Red Clay Rambler, where he interviews artists from the field, and it's become this real amazing archive of American ceramics that you can listen to if you have a chance. And then Stuart Gare, who makes soda-fired vessels that he graduated from University of Nebraska in Lincoln. Very simple, but I mean, simple is so hard, but he just does such a nice job. These really beautiful forms. So you can see what started as a simple vision has had a lasting impact in the state of Montana, and really just appreciate the efforts that people like Archie and the community members in Helena have kind of gotten us to this place that we've been able to enjoy. So that's it. That's everything I've got for you. Thank you.
Two questions. Do you have any copyright issues when you're doing the tiger and the magpies? And secondly, what is your operating budget for the foundation?
I like that wide range of question. The first question, I did consult with a copyright lawyer to just make sure I wasn't doing anything. I mean, it's a tiger, and they are magpies. We'll just sort of leave it there. But I'm also not necessarily trying to, make any sort of negative statement about those things. I mean, for me, it's really just about kind of highlighting that part of my history and association with those images. So I hope not. And then the second question, our operating budget's about $1.5 million, but I think we get a lot done for what we have. I mean, we have a pretty fantastic staff that work hard, do good work, and stretch the funding that we have.
In your time of travel in Asia, did you by chance ever get a chance to see that Korean jar with grapevines and see what was on the other side?
Good question. So the question was, did I have a chance to see that first image of that grapevine jar? And the answer is no. But I know where it is, but I didn't know where it was when I was there. And I think the next time I go to Korea, it's definitely going to be on the top of my list to go see. I believe it's at Ewha University as part of their collection, and it's, I think, been designated as like one of the national treasures in Korea. So yeah, I'd love to see it and just see how big it is. Even though you get the dimensions, sometimes it's hard to tell. That was one thing, I mentioned this on Friday, that being able to have access to that jar that was in the collection here, even just something as simple as like being able to pick it up, and feeling the weight of it was like really, it was just such a great experience, because I mean, you learn a lot about things, not just from seeing or reading, but like really interacting with those objects. And if you look closely on the interior rim of that jar, there's a mark that I think was maybe from the factory that it was created, but it's scratched into this interior of the neck. So you almost miss it, but it's this great little thing that you can just, you might overlook the first time around. So anyway, I hope to get to see it next time I'm there.
I want to thank you so much for the lecture. I was thinking about your work as I was driving into the museum today, and I should say that I'm the curator of Asian art here, and I'm so struck with the depth of the resonance of historical references in your works. And so I would like to encourage members of the audience to contemplate the conversations that Stephen's work is having with the Chinese ceramics in the Chinese gallery that's on the north side or the south side of the foyer coming in from Park Avenue, but also there are contemporary Japanese ceramic artists who I think, if you walk down that gallery, you can see glazes that are dripping, and you can see people that are working with deformed shapes. And in our Korean gallery, where we have now on view both the inlaid celadons and blue and whites, and I sort of feel that I want to put all these pots in a room and let them have a party together, because there are so many wonderful conversations. But the thing that I was puzzled about as I was driving in, and that I think you've done a wonderful job answering today, is that when you can do perfection, why have you explored this path of allowing pieces to sort of self-destruct? And I think you answered that so well in the lecture, so I wanted to compliment you on that.
Oh, thank you.
Wonderful talk. Thank you.
And I guess I wanted to say too, it's like I in no way think of myself as a scholar, and I love talking to folks like yourself who really understand the history and the context of these objects. And I've learned so much from just speaking to curators and scholars, and like just finding out those little things that you otherwise, because you've spent the time like really analyzing it and understanding it, and you don't necessarily get that from even the textbook, and yeah, it's been a real pleasure to be able to pick your brains.
Yep. Thinking about your comments briefly about the Archie Bray and withholding some of the talent and minds and creators within the city, meaning that some have stayed around and helped to keep that kindling going on. What your thoughts are maybe about a city like Portland here, where we're losing some of our great arts organizations, educational or otherwise. Mm-hmm. And I might cry up just talking about it, but just wondering your thoughts about how we could try to, maintain some of that talent, or embrace the culture more, even because we seem to feel that and advertise it, but there's a lot of reality happening that seems to speak otherwise.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something that's certainly been present in conversation, I guess. Because I know people who are involved in the museum, or in like Oregon College of Art and Crafts or different places like that. It's hard to say. I mean, I think maybe you don't always have the full story of what's going on, so you don't want to make assumptions about things either. But at the same time, you hope that you can support places and keep them vibrant, in the community. I mean, honestly, I'd say make sure to support the places that are doing a good job. I mean, like this museum is one great example of that. Or, it's just there are places I think that you want to invest in and that are going to continue to provide those services into this community. And I was really touched because on Friday there were a whole bunch of folks that came out that are involved in the ceramics community. And to Grace's comment, I think you can have an honorary membership into the ceramics community anytime you want. But it is, that part too is just coming out to support people that or that, who are part of this effort, to try to keep that present, and hopefully you'll be able to retain as much of that as you can. I mean, the Bray is a great example where there's no way the place would have been successful without all the people in Helena, in Montana, that have carried us through the tough times, and have been there even when it wasn't so tough. I think being consistent with that is pretty crucial, and hopefully believing in what we're doing enough to, either support it in terms of time, support it in terms of ideas, support it in terms of money, support it in terms of whatever it might be. I think there's a lot of ways that you can do that. So hopefully that will happen, with some of those places.
Thank you so much, Stephen, again.
Thank you all. Yeah, we really appreciate it. Thanks for being here today.